All right, thanks everybody for tuning in today. I want to welcome today's speaker, who I think I met Greg, I want to say probably 6 or 7 years ago, but Greg can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Greg's day job is at Purdue University, but today he's going to be representing some of his volunteer duties as the lead for the DevOps team on the SCinet effort, which is the network provider for the supercomputing conference. And I wanted him to talk about a real down in the weeds sort of topic of some of the stuff that they do with their activities on a yearly basis. And Greg thought that talking about some of the identity and access management that they put together over the past couple of years would be a great overview to provide, and maybe useful for some people who are trying to get this going for their home institutions. So Greg, I will turn it over to you to give us your talk and your demos that you were planning on trying to do.
All right, thanks, Jason. And yeah, that does sound about right. I think SC14 was my first year, so that would be about 7 years ago now. So today we're talking all about identity and access management on SCinet, and subtitled this Enterprise IAM on a Shoestring Budget. For those that aren't familiar with SCinet, we kind of occupy this really weird niche where we operate at the scale of a fairly substantial ISP or a research network provider, yet being associated with a conference, we don't have a really big budget. So it's been kind of interesting solving some of the technical challenges over the years in that space. It's pretty easy to get donations for things like big core routers at SC. It's a little bit harder to get donations for some of this low-level infrastructure stuff. So as Jason said, I'm Greg Veldman. I'm talking to you today with my SCinet DevOps team lead hat on. That's a role I've had for the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. My day job is the senior data storage engineer at Purdue University. So as you can imagine, when you're talking about people's data, they're pretty particular about making sure it's well protected and only authorized people can get at it. So I've had 1 foot or half a foot or some amount of my time in the IAM world for a very long time now. So overview of what we're going to talk about, where we started. This is kind of the state of things back when I did come on SCinet for the first time, and that was, as Jason said, a few years ago now. Motivation for why we wanted to change things. We're going to talk about what we moved to, which is a central directory approach and some self-service tools that we've deployed. We're going to get into a little bit of advanced things like multi-factor and single sign-on. And then the last bit is going to be what I've called integrations. That's basically how all the pieces, parts fit together and how we actually use all this stuff in our day-to-day operations. My slide deck is pretty bare bones, as Jason kind of alluded to. I know it's a little risky, but I'm going to try and actually go interactive and do some real live demos at various points along this and actually let you see how this stuff works in real life with live data, with live accounts, live apps, things that we actually use day to day on SCinet. So I'm hoping that all works and you can see some of this stuff in action. So where we started, within SCinet, one of the primary responsibilities of the DevOps team, and back when I joined it was called IT Services, is the maintenance of our yearly network planning tool and the connection request system. This is kind of the main tool that SCinet uses to figure out every year at the conference, who's plugging into what port, what IP network and VLAN they're getting, where the rolls of fiber are rolling out on the floor, that sort of thing. And this tool has used Django since the very early days of Django. And this is going back probably 14, 15 years. I've found commits in our code base, back that old. And initially, where we started is basically all SCinet users were stored in the Django apps users table that drove this internal database. That was kind of our authoritative source of accounts. And as other use cases emerged for different things that we did, they were kind of bolted onto that existing framework. So this kind of grew over the years and, very kind of organically without a lot of necessarily planning. this led to some interesting things. Obviously, this is a model that doesn't scale very well. That's kind of why we changed it, and I'll talk about that. But we had very interesting things like custom permissions in Django that were not tied to any model that we were using for external authorization for things that we would manually populate. We had a very interesting and complex save method for the user models to handle kind of all the business logic of accounts management. This would be things like, local shell scripts to inject accounts into our wiki, into RT, which is our help desk system. Authentication is primarily through Radius, and we really didn't have a central real-time lookup to actually get account data. Our Radius do is also very weird. It was backed by a custom Perl script that would actually go pull all the relevant data directly out of Postgres, out of the DB, and then manually compare password hashes to allow HTTP basic off. So we had Radius backed by Perl computing a password hash and then going and doing a string comparison to what was in the database. So some kind of interesting things where we started. Non-web accounts were handled by custom Django management commands that we had written over the years. These would actually reach, again, into the live database and pull out the data that they needed in the appropriate format. And then we had other things that would go push that around. For example, for accounts on some of our Unix hosts that we maintain, we've been Puppet users on SCinet for a long time. So we had Puppet code that would go and call this Django management command that we had written, which would spit out like etc password and etc shadow lines and SSH authorized keys files for every user. And then Puppet would take those and go push them out and onto the actual Unix servers. Similar things for switches. We had management commands that actually spat out iOS and Junos AAA code that could go and create users on the devices and switches. Very interesting, kind of difficult to maintain over time. As part of that, we had our local user models become quite large to handle all these use cases. At last count, our custom internet user model that we used to kind of define all this stuff was a full 33 columns for a SCinet member. And that didn't include any of the existing Django auth user columns. That was just all the stuff that we had added on in our local model over the year. So motivation for change, obviously the main one is the desire to move to a more scalable and standards-based approach, certainly with an eye towards maintainability. A lot of the things that we had been doing were kind of custom and in-house, and not a lot of people knew about them, and they were kind of odd, and it was difficult to teach new people. So we wanted to go with tools that were more broadly adopted, stick to standards wherever we could, and of course, document everything and make it look like someone coming in might expect, and might look somewhat familiar to them. Obviously, we also wanted to be able to support a large number of diverse clients natively, because a lot of our stuff is donated, our hardware and things at the conference each year. We don't have a lot of say in what we get. Unlike a lot of ISPs, we can't just say, yeah, we're a Cisco shop. And, if Brocade or Juniper or someone else comes along, just say, no, thanks, we're a Cisco shop. We kind of have to take what we can get and integrate it and make it work, which is always one of the big challenges and frankly, one of the fun things on SCinet is making all these things work together. So we wanted to have good support for that in our authentication authorization layer. We wanted to reduce the complexity of our middleware and wherever possible, remove it from the authentication and authorization workflows. This would be things like that Perl script for Radius I was telling you about before. In a large, complex organization, you're always going to have a certain amount of middleware just to implement your local business logic. We wanted to simplify it, and we wanted to get it out of the actual path of logging in, so we weren't waiting for that. So we didn't mind if it was doing processing in the background and populating data and that kind of stuff, But as far as the login process itself was concerned, we wanted that to be all standards-based and well-known, well-documented tools. Another big thing was we wanted to make changes to core account data visible in real time across the entire infrastructure. This was a big problem before. As I mentioned, we had these Django management commands, and we had Puppet and other shell scripts and cron jobs running to push the account data around from there to everywhere. Well, there was always some amount of delay in that. And, that's been an issue a couple times. Certain cases where, you might have a user that got their password compromised and they want to change it right away and have that change take effect immediately. There have been one or two cases where we've had to disable an account, right now for various reasons, and we wanted to be able to do that in real time. So we wanted to, as much as possible, have a peer client-server approach where all the clients were talking directly to the server, pulling the data in real time, and we weren't waiting on things in the background to push this data around, where if you had to make a change quickly, you were stuck waiting for the process, or you had to go kick it off manually or things like that. And that's, again, mostly for things that are actually in the authentication and authorization workflow. We were tolerant of some delays in data management or transforms where you had things being pushed out to various cases and non-critical use cases. I'm thinking, for example, things like mailing list memberships. If it takes someone a half an hour to get subscribed to a mailing list when their account is created, that's not a big deal. Another big thing is we wanted to make our IAM data distributed and fault tolerant. And that includes what we're actually doing now and have done for the last few years is having a local copy on a server at the conference. That way, if we ever, for some reason, do lose our WAN link or have some network issue, we've got all our account data right there, so our engineers can still log into the devices and fix that problem, and not be running around with laptops and serial cables and things like that. That's not very convenient. As I mentioned before, when we started, a lot of this data was backed by the Django app and it was in our Postgres database. That's not exactly the most distributed way, at least in real time. Doing replication with tools like AD and OpenLDAP is certainly a lot better supported and a lot faster than trying to replicate an entire Postgres database and your code base that uses it and a web server and all this other stuff that goes along with it. So this is kind of where we headed. Based on our requirements that I talked about, the use of LDAP seemed an obvious answer for what we wanted to do. So beginning in 2015, we started using OpenLDAP to expose data from the Django tables through the LDAP protocol. There is a little module called backSQL in OpenLDAP that allows the directory server to actually pull its backend data out of a SQL database. So we were using this, and it wasn't really native format on disk. It was still all in Django, but we were exposing it over a common protocol, which was kind of the first step. So what this did is allowed us to start the process of transitioning, where we were taking some of our newer things and having them use LDAP natively, whereas we could still support those older things that were using some of these kind of hacks that had been developed over the years. And it allowed us for a time to kind of have our cake and eat it too, as we tested how this process would work before we tried to cut over everything. And we wanted to make sure we didn't break anything along the way. This was, I think, a good approach. The setup cost was a bit high, but it was ultimately worth it to give us time to properly convert and test our legacy apps without having everything cut over all at once. Setup costs, those of you that have looked at backSQL at all, OpenLDAP requires its data to be in a very specific format in the database when you use that. It's not very customizable. And of course, Django has everything in its own internal format. So there were many complex and custom views that we had to write in the database to get the Django data into a table format that was compatible with BackSQL to expose it this way. So getting this thing going did take a while, and there's a lot of code that we have written for SQL views and things to make that happen. But once that was initially done, it actually worked quite well, and I think was worth the effort to give us that flexibility. Of course, we still had the replication lag issue. BackSQL is not compatible with OpenLDAP sync REPL, so in order to move this data around from the primary server to some of our backup sites around the country or to the conference, we were still relying on replicating the whole database, including the views, and if we wanted to manage anything, replicating our whole code base and web server and all that as well. So it was a step in the right direction, but we still had a little ways to go. So between SC17 and SC18 and that kind of transition period was when we decided to do the big cutover and move everything to fully native OpenLDAP with an LMDB backend. For those not familiar with SC or SCinet, typically there's a period right after the conference in like December and January where no one just really wants to think about SC related things at all, and everyone just kind of goes dark and quiet. And that's a really good time to do really low-level major infrastructure changes because everyone else is just kind of in hibernation. So that's when we kind of targeted to do this work. So in order to do this transition, we used what we had already, our OpenLDAP with BackSQL, to output our entire directory into LDIF format, perform a few minor tweaks, and reload into a brand new directory. The reason we did this is because we figured LDIF would be the easiest way to do this interchange. And a few minor tweaks, there are certain things that it's just easier to go in and do with sed and awk than to try and hack BackSQL infinitely to spit everything out in exactly the way you wanted it. So we dumped the database to a text file, flushed everything, created a brand new empty database, and then did a reload from scratch. At this point, OpenLDAP became the authoritative IAM source for everything on SCinet. And we changed over our intranet app, which again is based on Django. There's an open source authentication plugin called Django Auth LDAP that basically just makes Django a normal consumer of that data, which is now in the LDAP directory instead of the provider. As far as management, we did a lot with directory ACLs to control administrative roles and associated privileges. That's probably the one a little bit unusual thing. If compared to a typical LDAP directory, we've got a lot of ACLs, probably 20, 25 different entries for various things. And that's to control who can go in and change what attributes, and there are different levels of access defined. For example, we may allow an individual user to go in and change some of the profile type attributes, things like their name, email address, picture, that kind of stuff, but only for their account. Whereas we might let the account managers or kind of designated people that help with this stuff to go in and change some more attributes and for everyone, but they can't touch anything that's a security sensitive account or is restricted in some way. And we have an admin level that can go in and change basically everything everywhere. The reason we did this in the directory instead of using one of our tools or interfaces is because we wanted to be able to support multiple different tools interacting with this, and by centralizing all that access control right in the directory, it doesn't matter what tool you use, you have the same permissions no matter how you come in. One of the big ones we use, which we'll talk about later, is PHP LDAP admin. You can go in and define access controls there, but if someone then comes and connects to the server with plain LDAP search and bypasses all that, it doesn't do you much good. So we wanted to make sure that everything was consistent. As I kind of just said, we also deployed various management clients as part of the transition for various use cases. Kind of the main one is PHP LDAP admin with some custom templates that we've developed. This is the kind of primary tool for both admins and users. So we've templated it so that when a user connects, it looks more like kind of a profile editor kind of application. They don't see a lot of the low-level nitty-gritty stuff that makes LDAP go. We've laid things out to be a little more friendly, given them names and descriptions that are easier to understand. And this is the primary interface that we've allowed users to go and change that kind of profile stuff. And then as admins, we can also use it to go in and create new accounts, reset things for people that need it. If an administrative change needs to be made for some reason, we can go in and do that as well. We wanted to be as much self-service as possible as well. We did not want to have people need to write into the help desk if they needed a simple change done or a password reset. So there's an LDAP toolbox project called Password Reset that we stood up as well. And this allows people to do self-service password resets if they forget their password. It supports email links or SMS-based tokens. So if you've defined a mobile number in your account, you can go in and get an SMS code to reset your password. There's also a neat little tool called ShellDAP that we use for lower level admin operations, and it allows easier interactions with the raw data. If you've not heard of this or seen it before, it's really cool. It's basically a small Perl script that allows you to interact with LDAP in much the same way that you interact with files on a Unix file system. So it has things like ls and cd and grep and cat and vi, and you can actually go in and interact with all your LDAP data kind of like you would a standard file, which is just a little bit easier paradigm for most people to understand than worrying about all the intricacies of LDAP search and LDAP modify. So at this point, we're going to try and do a couple demos and actually show you some of these tools in action. If I can get my... If I can get it to go. I just have to... All right, well, we're going to stop the slideshow for a minute. We'll come back to that. Window switching wasn't working there. So we'll start and we'll show you the self-service tool. Maybe. And of course, it's not working. I am going to stop sharing my screen for just a second, Jason, and see if it looks like something has maybe grabbed my keyboard and wasn't letting me type.
Sure thing. I can't blame Windows, you know. I knew that was going to be your root cause.
Yeah, I was maybe too optimistic to think that it would work without any issues. All right, let's try this again.
There we go.
All right, so this is our actual password recovery site. I have made a demo account, and we're going to actually just go ahead and try resetting his password. So that just sent me a link to my email account. And paste that. ahead and put in a new password there. And there you go. So this is the kind of the typical workflow that we do with a new account on SCinet. We will set the account up, and then there is a script that we run that sends them a welcome email with kind of a few basic pointers of these are some of the tools you'll be using on SCinet. This is where they're located. Here's how you go in and set an initial password for your account, and points them to this page. They can go in, enter their username, their email address, and they'll get a link and be able to reset their password for the first time without any requirement to talk to the help desk or interact with one of the admins or anything like that. So very self-service. So we'll go and look at the accounts portal now. What I'm actually logging into here is our single sign-on app. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is a heavily customized PHP LDAP admin. So this is basically your personal account portal that you can go in and set various attributes for yourself as you like. So you can see all the stuff that's pre-populated here when the account is created, your name, your user ID, email, UID number, all that stuff. We can go in and let's just set an attribute here and say that my demo account also works for Purdue University. There's a lot of stuff here. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these things later on when we get to the integration section. But for now, we'll just go in and set that organization attribute. And as you can see, I've just made a change to my account. All right, we're going to go back to slideshow again. So multi-factor authentication, MFA was made available to all of SCinet in the summer of 2019. Kind of the main motivation for this, with tens of millions of dollars of loaned equipment, some of it being, very early engineering prototype, pre-production kinds of things, bleeding edge technology that we get in a lot of cases. We realized that we wanted to make sure that we secured the access to those. It would kind of not be a good thing for SCinet if someone's account got compromised and vendor B was able to get onto some, super bleeding edge pre-production hardware from vendor A and see its interfaces and the protocols it supported and things like that. Being an organization that relies a lot on donations, we want to make sure we take good care of the organizations that are donating things to us and do our due diligence to protect their assets, and one of those ways being from unauthorized access. So that was kind of the main reason we wanted to make this available. At the moment, its use or requirement is kind of at the discretion of SCinet management and the team leads, but certainly encouraged for those members in sensitive roles. We don't force this on everyone because there are roles in SCinet where you don't have access to a lot of valuable stuff. And we certainly encourage it, but we don't want to make a central mandate that everyone has to use this and create problems for account lockouts and things of that nature. In my role as chairman of the DevOps team, I've kind of said on DevOps it's required for anyone that has privileged access to any of our infrastructure, servers, applications, etc. So if someone comes to me and says, I need super user access in Django, my response is going to be, great, have you set up MFA for your account? And if not, go do it. And at the moment, that's kind of on the honor system. We do have ways of enforcing that. We're not using any of those at the moment. And as far as implementation, it's just standard RFC 6238 TOTP. Pretty common for those of you that are doing MFA. For the interface for this, again, user admin, we're using Privacy Idea, which is an open source tool. That does all the token management. So that's where you go in and sign up. You can activate or deactivate a token. as admins, we can go in and remove tokens if they're lost or compromised. We can lock them if we need to, things of that nature. However, all validation for your password, and that's both factors, is done directly in OpenLDAP. And the reason we wanted to do that is we wanted to avoid the delay of reaching out to an external app API to validate the OTP part. We also wanted to make sure that we kept things as simple as possible and eliminate any dependencies we could. We didn't want to depend on privacy ID and the web server and the database and all the infrastructure that drives that being up all the time. We wanted to make sure that we could take those things down for maintenance and still have authentication. Also, kind of going back to what I've said a few times, it's harder to replicate those things than it is to replicate just pure OpenLDAP data. So to implement this, there was an existing OpenLDAP contrib PassDB backend module that did TOTP. And it was basically just the one-time password for authentication. So SCinet actually developed and extended that to do the multi-factor part, where we took that OTP that was already there and then also added the ability to store and validate a static password, hashed password, of course. That code was developed by SCinet as part of this initiative and has actually contributed back to the OpenLDAP project. So those of you that are interested in doing this, that's out there right now. You can go fetch it off openldap.org or GitHub or wherever you get your code from, and it's in the code base. Anyone can use this. And we wanted to give that back to the community because we found it useful. As far as the integration between those two, for those that have looked at Privacy Idea, it has a concept of triggers that can happen on certain events in the application. So we defined certain triggers for when a token is created or modified or enabled or disabled or anything like that. And that calls a little Python script that we wrote that goes and takes the seed for that token and actually puts it into the LDAP database. And then the contrib module knows how to validate your password and the token based on those two things that are stored in your user password string in LDAP. Again, this happens pretty much instantaneously. There might be a second or two of delay while the script runs. All our directory servers are using this module. It supports this, so we can sync REPL this around everywhere we need to, and you can authenticate against any of those servers. They all know how to do it, and Privacy Idea becomes basically just the management interface, and we take it out of the actual authentication workflow. As a backup, we do have an out-of-band script that is run twice a day from cron, just to ensure that everything in LDAP is trued up with all the active tokens from Privacy Idea. This has saved us once or twice. It's been a while since we've had to rely on that. One of the big things, and anyone familiar with SCLinux, we try and run all our servers with SCLinux enforcing mode, and an SCLinux update at some point blocked that trigger in Privacy Idea from talking to LDAP and updating the tokens. And so our fallback was doing that for a while until we realized that and fixed it. So we're going to attempt to switch to another demo here.
So while you're switching over, Greg, there was one question here that you may be able to answer. Andy wanted to know, and this is not specific to SCinet, but do you have any idea if there is a TOTP-like module for doing the same thing with 389DS?
I do not know off the top of my head. I vaguely remember at one point reading that there was something for another implementation of LDAP. I don't remember if it was 389DS or something else.
Okay.
That was probably a year and a half ago, so I've slept a lot since then, and I wouldn't take that with a grain of salt. So we're actually going to go ahead and look at our MFA interface here. And before we start, So this is shelled up. I talked a little bit about it before, but I'm actually in it, and this is our demo account. So I'm going to look up his user password, and of course, my session is timed out, so I have to log in again. Give me just a second, because I'm on as an admin, so I need to look up my OTP. So there's his existing password. You can see it's just a standard SSHA password. We're going to go in as our demo account. And it's just a static password here that I use to log in. If you were paying attention when I reset it, you saw it was 8 characters there. It's 8 characters now. And we're going to create a new token for ourselves here. And it's going to be TOTP. That's the only choice because that's what we support. And we can put some nice description associated with it to tell you what it is. And enroll the token. And I could then go ahead and scan this on my phone and put it in my OTP app so I could use this in the future. We're going to skip that for now. And I can see now that I have 1 token enrolled. And if we come back to our shelled up window, we can see that my password for this account is now using the TOTP and PW scheme, which is the scheme that we defined in the code that we wrote for OpenLDAP. And so this is the actual OTP seed. I don't really care if you see it. I'm going to delete this account as soon as the talk is done. And then this is our static hash password that was there before. Go back to our slideshow here. And we'll talk a little bit about single sign-on. So like many fairly large organizations, SCinet uses a lot of internal tools and a lot of third parties to provide different services for different things. And that typically entails a lot of accounts. So we wanted to minimize the number of credentials that each member needed to remember. And we also wanted to provide a consistent logon experience. I have enough passwords and accounts to things to log into for all the stuff I do anyways. I don't need 8 more for SCinet. 1 is enough. So it's part of what drove this. We went ahead and developed an in-house app, again, based on Django because we just have a lot of expertise in Django. It provides a SAML2 IDP and an OpenID Connect provider. The reason we wanted to do it that way, there are a lot of things out there that do this kind of stuff. I hadn't seen any really good one that did both, and we wanted to be able to support federation no matter what protocol the client or the service provider was using. So these are, by far the 2 most popular ones in this space. We wanted to be able to support them both from a single application. And the application does a few other things as well, again, which we'll talk about when we get into integrations and that kind of stuff. So, as I said, implemented as a Django project. We're using Django SAML2 IDP, which is an open source IDP for SAML for Django. That's out there. It's pip installable. It's on GitHub. We're using Django OIDC provider for the OIDC side. Again, it's on GitHub. It's pip installable. Anyone can use it. And then on the backside, to talk to our directory, we're using Django auth LDAP as we are in a lot of our other Django projects that we use. So we locally developed this app. And basically, the purpose of the app is to kind of tie all these things together and then to implement some SCinet-specific logic, mainly around access control. We can control which accounts are allowed to log into which things. We're not doing it today, but there's the capability if we ever wanted to do time restrictions or anything like that. This app is where we put all that kind of stuff. Ideally, we would like to kind of just be an identity provider and let the service that's using this do all this. In some cases, that's just not possible. One of the big things we use is G Suite. G Suite doesn't really have a concept of, taking custom assertions from SAML and deciding if you can log in or not. It's kind of, if you have an account and you authenticate, you're good. So if we don't want someone to be able to get into G Suite for some reason, we can do access control logic here in the app that says, yeah, you've authenticated, but I see you're trying to log into Google and you're not allowed, so throw an error. So let's try and do another demo here and show you this in action. So this is our SCinet SSO app. There's not a lot here. It's just a static page. It says this is SCinet SSO. And there is an endpoint, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the next slide. But there's an auth endpoint that can just kind of show you basic information about your account. So I can see that I'm logged in as demo here, and these are the things I can do. So since I'm logged in already, we're going to go ahead and sign in to our data center management app. And you'll note this is a different server than we were on before. And so this should come and do a SAML authentication against our SSO and then redirect me back into OpenDSIM, which is the app we use, as a demo account. And there's the SAML, and I am now in our DSIM app as the demo user. So integrations, this is kind of what I was talking about, how we actually use this stuff and how it all fits together. Obviously, one of the main integrations that we're always going to have is a certain amount of middleware for things that just don't fit well into existing workflows. OpenLDAP is great. It's not a processing engine. It's a data storage and authentication engine. And any decent-sized organization is always going to have some amount of business logic that requires the IAM data, but requires it to be used in interesting ways. A couple of examples for us. We push accounts to places that can't use LDAP directly. So I mentioned G Suite already. We have a Google Apps domain. We use that extensively. We have Slack. So we have some scripts that run periodically throughout the day that look at the accounts that are in LDAP, the accounts that are in G Suite, and create accounts or modify accounts or delete accounts as needed. Obviously, with single sign-on, we want everything to be as seamless as possible, but single sign-on is just that. It's sign-on. It's not account management. So if you try and sign into Google and you don't have an account on Google, it's not going to let you, no matter what the IDP says. So we have to actually get your accounts up there in some way. We also update a little bit of info in the directory that's not set directly, or that would be kind of redundant to set directly. A big one is POSIX group memberships, which come from our Teams data in LDAP. So for those familiar with OpenLDAP, when you're setting up a directory and thinking about how you're going to store your users, there are kind of two different distinct routes you can go based on structural object class for your people. And you can go the person, INET.org person route, or the account, POSIX account route. And that's because you're only allowed to have one structural object class for each object. So on SCinet, we went the person and INET.org person route. It's just more flexible. There's more attributes that are available. You can do more things, but there are one or two little POSIX type things that just aren't in that object class. And so we have scripts that kind of take the data that's there, figure out what those attributes should be, and then populate them. And that way, when someone goes in and creates an account or modifies an account, they don't have to do double duty. They don't have to go in and set, teams and other things, and then also go update your group memberships. It just happens automatically in the background. We have several other internal tools that don't really authenticate or authorize users per se, but they still use LDAP as a data source. An example would be our mailman lists. There are a few central lists that we want everyone that's active to be on and no one that's not active to be on. So we populate those right from LDAP because that's the authoritative source of who exists and who's active and who's not. And again, that just happens in the background, out of band. Another one is member mail forwarding. When you get a SCinet account, you also get a email address. You probably remember on the first slide, my email address was gv@supercomputing.org. Well, I don't need yet another place to go check email. So by default, when we create that address for everyone, we just have it auto forward to whatever your account address that you signed up with is, typically your work address. And that all happens in real time as well. Postfix on our mail server will simply just go and look up your email from the LDAP directory in real time and generate a forwarding rule on the fly anytime a message comes in for you. So these are things that aren't really doing authentication and authorization per se, but we still want to have that data available. I'm not watching chat, so I don't know if there's any questions. I can imagine someone watching this will comment one might be why you don't use some of the existing overlays to do some of this stuff. There are a couple that are written for this. All of them have limitations that it was easier to just kind of write middleware to resolve them than try and hack the code and change the way it works. SLAPO dime list is kind of a popular one for this. A lot of people will use. The issue with dime list is that it generates attributes on the fly, which means you can't use them in a search filter, and we have several cases where we want to be able to do that. SLAPO member of is another common one. It's not multi-master replication safe. So that's why we are doing some of this stuff in middleware as opposed to using the things that are out there and that exist.
So no questions in chat yet, but I bet you that you probably short-circuited some of them.
Oh, wonderful. I always like when I can short-circuit a question. Other things, obviously this is kind of the part where we talk about how it all works. So the end goal of all this is we want to make any type of system device that SCinet uses to be able to make use of our authentication authorization data in real time in the format that it expects. That's the end goal for everything we've done over the years. So being a network provider, we have a lot of things that that use Radius for authentication. So our Radius D is now, instead of being backed by an in-house Perl script, backed by RLM LDAP and available for use for any network device that supports it. Again, much more standardized and maintainable. Also lets you do some authorization control in LDAP, which is kind of cool. We've got documentation and extensive examples for LDAP configs for several different platforms, probably 2 or 3 different Linux distros, some switches. So any team that is standing up a device or service that wants to use IAM data centrally, we've got good guides in our wiki how to do that. SSH public keys, instead of having Puppet pull files out of Django management commands and push them around, they are now stored in LDAP directly. They're checked in real time. There's a couple of add-ons to OpenSSH where you can tell it to go build an authorized keys list for a user on the fly using a command. For CentOS, that's even a yum package that you can just install and you don't even have to go and download or build anything. We're using that so that all our SSH public keys come from LDAP instead of having to be pushed around every single system. We have several attributes in the directory that are used for access control to various resources. We have kind of a global master enable disable switch. So with one change of one attribute, we can turn an account off everywhere. Like I said earlier, there's been 1 or 2 cases over the years where we've had to do that for various reasons. So we have that ability. We can do access control based on different applications that you're authorized to use. We can do it based on which teams you're a member of. We can add host attributes to your directory entry to say you're allowed to log into specific hosts and not others. And some of these things are actually can be delegated and set directly by authorized team members. So if I was, say, the WAN team lead and I needed to stand up a Unix server for something, and I wanted to allow people to log into it, I could actually be delegated by DevOps the authority to go into LDAP and add or delete host equals WAN from any attribute for any object in the directory in real time, self-service, and to control access to my host. And any other team can do that as well. A lot of the things we do, as you've kind of probably figured out over the course of this talk, are web-based. Our main web app server is Nginx, and we are using the sub-request authentication module for that against the auth endpoint on our SSO app that I showed you before. We went with using that because it's readily available. Most Nginxes have that built in, or at least you can compile it in natively with just a configure flag. You don't have to patch anything. And it allows you to do both authentication and access control in the same thing. So we're using that to control access to a lot of our things that would otherwise just use HTTP basic auth. Examples would be like our wiki kind of things. And that can actually go in and validate against certain required flags for access control. So we're actually going to do one more demo where I show you how that works. Again, we're going to go back to our SSO endpoint. So this is our auth endpoint. So what we can do here is we can actually dynamically construct the request in Nginx based on the application you're authenticating against, and by which parameters, which URL path we use here, because that's about the extent of the customization you can do in sub-request auth, you can check for the presence of specific things. So if I want to check, for example, just anyone that's authenticated at all is allowed access, I would just use /auth, and the fact that you're seeing this page means that I'm good to go. If I want to check for someone that has account enabled and can access DSIM, which is what the single sign-on to our DSIM app a minute ago actually does, I can do that. And now I can see that I've requested capabilities, account enabled, and can access DSIM. And since my user holds both those capabilities, again, I'm enabled. If I add another one, say super secret, now I get a 403 because I don't have that capability. So we can do really fine-grained access control, not super dynamically because it's in the Nginx configs, but based on which application you're using in Nginx. So it gives us a lot of flexibility. And again, where these all come from is your accounts app. So these are all our access control flags. And again, to keep things simple, when you're looking at them here, it's just checkboxes. So any of our admins or account managers can come in and turn these on and off as needed for individual users. Of course, the directory ACLs that are in place prevent a user from doing that himself. So if I went in and tried to give myself access to the help desk, for example, it would tell me I'm not allowed to do that. And then some of the other ones I talked about, there's our login allowed host, which is the host list. This is all the teams that exist, so you can select, again, this is restricted to just account managers and admins. So if I were to try and go and add myself to the architecture team, I would also not be allowed to do that. So that's the end of my talk and demos. If anyone has any questions, happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up the chat window and see if there's any questions
Yeah,
here.
so thanks for going through that, Greg. Really interesting stuff, and the fact that it's sort of built over the past couple of years. Andy self-answered his question about free radius. So
Yes, I saw that one.
if anybody does have any other questions, please type them in. I have just a couple here. It's always hard to estimate these things, but what would you say that the man hours that you've put in to sort of convert it from the bad old days to sort of today? Are we talking person months here, person years to get everything in place, or were you able to pretty much use off the shelf components and with a little bit of integrations?
Oh my, that's a tricky one because it's happened over the course of so many years. I haven't really kept track. As you've kind of seen in the talk, we've made every effort to keep things as standardized and simple as we can. Any place we can, we use off-the-shelf stuff. Everything we're using is either developed in-house, so we have the source, or open source. So, it's very maintainable and extensible. If I had to guess, I would say probably all told, it's on the order of person weeks. I don't think we're quite at the level of person months.
Okay. And I guess the other one that I have, and it's another sort of hard one to measure. It's more of a how happy are people. Have you found that sort of simplifying all of the different ways to access things has benefited the SCinet volunteers? Like, I don't know if you were keeping track of either complaints or grumblings in the past, but have you found it's been a lot easier to sort of do all the tasks of management? And have you found that people are less inclined to ask for help now that there's a lot of self-service ways to do these things?
I don't have a lot of metrics on that to answer that scientifically. I will say that anecdotally, I think the load on those of us kind of managing the accounts has gone down quite significantly. I would say the biggest decrease came when we deployed the self-service password reset. Some of the other things have also helped, but I don't think anything quite as much as that one. As with any organization, our biggest source of tickets is going to be, I forgot my password. This is especially true of an organization like SCinet, where, we're all volunteers and we kind of sort of think about this for 6 months and then think about it almost exclusively for like a month and then go into hibernation for 3 months. And, you come back again in March or April and, I can't remember what my password was last November. I think that's been a big help. I can say as kind of the main person that runs all the accounts on SCinet and doing all the administrative stuff, these tools have made it a lot easier from a management and administration perspective. Certainly having everything standardized helps track down issues. I spend probably 90% of my time doing accounts management stuff in that PHP LDAP admin window, and I can do just about anything I need to do from there. And because of the templates, a lot of it is just, point and click, enable this checkbox, turn off this checkbox, fill in a text value on this form. And then it just kind of magically goes everywhere it needs to go. And that's certainly a lot easier than the bad old days where to set up an account, I needed to log into, 5 or 6 different things and do 2 or 3 manual data copies and all that kind of stuff.
Yep, understood. So we do have a question that came in from Andy. For apps like RT, for example, if you have have it brought into Web SSO rather than just LDAP auth, did you have to use a web server SP module and pass through remote user to RT, or did you find some other way to push SAML further into RT? And he's asking because he wants to try to explore some options there.
Yeah, so RT has been kind of interesting because we've done just about everything for RT. In the bad old days, it was strictly the remote user environment variable, and it was HTTP basic. And again, as I was kind of saying at the beginning, the the actual creation of the account was done manually or by some out-of-band script. RT does have native LDAP support, and it can also support auto-creating users on the fly from LDAP. That's what we're doing now. So we have it configured against our directory, and if you log in, it'll try and authenticate you against LDAP. If the authentication is successful, which again relies on some of those access control flags that I was telling you about before, and there's no matching object in the database with that username, it'll just go ahead and create one with whatever default parameters we've assigned in the config. Basically, the big one is that we just set all accounts that can log in to be privileged because we assume they're SCinet people, so they can go and interact with any ticket. RT does have some limited SAML support. I've been following it not all that closely over the years. I know even as recently as 2-3 years ago, it wasn't all that great. From what I've seen, it's gotten a lot better now. So it's entirely possible that at some point we will convert our RT to be a SAML SP. Probably at some point when we do some major upgrade on it. But at the moment, the native LDAP integration is working pretty well for us. And that kind of just works, and we really don't have to think about it.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. So I'll go ahead and thank you again for giving the talk. When you get a chance, send me the slides. I'll make sure that those get posted. And then for those that are still listening, please note that next week's talk is not going to be Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be a different day. It's going to be Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern. And the reason is because we have 3 speakers coming from 3 different continents. We have someone coming from Africa, Europe, and Australia, and they're going to be talking about global BCP for routing and policy security. So because of that, I wasn't going to make them all stay up until 3 a.m., their local times in some cases. So hopefully that time will not be a challenge for some of you. If it is, we'll certainly record like we always do. So thanks to everybody for joining today, and you're welcome, Andy. I think that if you don't have Greg's email address, I'll shoot it to you, and you can pick his brain more about stuff that you need to do to integrate some things over on your end.
Yes, certainly.
Right.
I'm happy to answer any questions from anyone. My email address was on the first slide. gv@purdue.edu also works if you want to reach me that way, and certainly happy to help out.
All right. So thanks, everybody, and have a good weekend. We'll talk to everybody next week.
Thanks, Jason. Bye.